Fiedler Audio is primarily known for their Dolby Atmos Composer plugin, which allows you to work with Dolby Atmos in virtually any digital audio workstation. I created several videos about the Dolby Atmos Composer, and we recently also had Thomas Fiedler as a guest on our podcast Spatial Audio Monthly, discussing the history of this exceptional plugin. If you're interested to dive deeper in this topic, I recommend checking these videos out. I'll provide some links in the description below. Fiedler Audio has just released a new plugin called Gravitas. This plugin offers a completely new approach to dynamics processing, especially for multi-channel audio, but also for traditional stereo setups. Most importantly, it can be used to set up Dolby Atmos master bus processing within the Dolby Atmos Composer. The manner in which Gravitas achieves this is unique and, in my opinion, incredibly exciting for anybody working with spatial audio. In today's video, we will therefore explore Gravitas and how it is used in a regular project as well as in conjunction with the Dolby Atmos Composer. One thing that we will demonstrate is how to use Gravitas to implement master bus type sidechaining in Dolby Atmos using the Dolby Atmos Composer in Ableton Live. So if you're interested in spatial audio, you don't want to miss this. Let's get started. Before we dive into our project for today, I want to provide a quick disclaimer. Fiedler Audio has provided me with a free license for Gravitas. However, they had no influence on what I'm going to say, and no one has seen this video before it goes live. I should also mention that while I'm using Ableton Live on a Mac for this video, the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate work on both Windows as well as Mac computers and on virtually any digital audio workstation available on the market today. And with that being said, let's open up our session in Ableton. Now, the session that I'm going to work with today should be familiar to many of you, especially if you're watching my channel regularly. It's a set of loops that I like to use a lot, simply because I never have any copyright issues with those. Let's just have a listen. So what we have here is essentially a pad track, then a combined bass keys track, and a synth track to round everything up. Now at the beginning, I'm only going to work with the bass and keys track. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to drop an instance of Gravitas on that track, and that will open up the user interface of Gravitas. Now there's a really good walkthrough video on Fiedler Audio's website. I'm going to leave a link in the description. If you want to know the details of that interface, I recommend that you watch that as well. Here I'm going to talk about most of the things, but I might miss one or the other. But once again, go to the Fiedler Audio website and there you will find all the details. Now, in essence, Gravitas consists of three modules. There's a top module here on top that contains all the usual suspects like a preset menu and an A/B possibility. And then there's also this little parameter linking window that we are going to talk about a little bit later. Then we have a center module, and this center module essentially contains a lot of information about how the audio is processed. We have an input gain. We have input parameter configuration. This is also something that we're going to talk about a little bit later, because that's actually one of the really interesting and unique features of Gravitas. Then we have the parameter setup, and we have two sets of parameters. We have essentially parameters for above threshold processing and parameters for below threshold processing. So you could think of that as compression and expansion, for example. And you have the usual suspects. You can change the threshold, the ratio, you can change the knee, and you can also change the range, which essentially means the range in which the processing actually takes place. Then we have a filter section, and this filter section applies to the actual processed signal. So this essentially allows you to select a certain range from your original signal, according to which or on which the compression actually takes place. And then we have the output section here with a makeup gain, and we can also do an auto gain, which is also something that's really important. And then we have a mix session here. And in the bottom module, we have additional parameters that allow us to control the details of the compression. But in order to see how that actually works, let me first start the audio. And once again, we see the incoming signal here. We see the compression. Currently, there isn't really any compression going. So if we change the threshold or the ratio or the knee, all the typical suspects that you have, and we can also do like a below threshold compression for some expansion, for example. And we can also set the knee here, and we can set the range. So if we want to have the signal only being processed in a certain range, we can do that as well. And then we can set the filter here. This is essentially selecting the signal that is actually processed. Everything that is not filtered out here is going to go through the compressor without any change. And then we have the makeup gain section here and the mix section. So everything is pretty much exactly the way it should be. Now, the one thing I should probably mention here is we have a mid-side processing knob kind of selection. So if we turn it on, then we have mid-side processing, and as soon as we turned it on, we have here two additional controls that allow us how much of the side channel is actually going to contribute to the compression. And that essentially kind of allows us to have some more finer control about what the compressor is actually doing. Now, if you have this plugin on a multi-channel track, let me just stop the signal for a second. Now, if you have this plugin on a multi-channel track, and this is actually one of the first unique features, this is a completely multi-channel compressor, so you can run, as we will see in Dolby Atmos, 128 channels through it. So if you have a multi-channel signal, then this here will turn into a control for the LFE signal. So you will see essentially a control that allows you to control how much of the LFE channel is going to contribute to the compression. And if you have two LFE channels, you will essentially have these two knobs become the two LFE channel knobs. But let's turn that off and let's turn that back on to regular stereo processing, and let's maybe restart the audio. Now, let me go back to the input selection here for a second. This is the input selector and the detector mixer. What this essentially allows you to do is it allows you to select what channels are contributing or what channels are driving the compressor. This is the detector input mixer. And we can also change the amount, how much a certain channel is going to contribute in order to run the compressor. We can mute individual channels. So for example, in this particular case, compression is only happening on the right side. We can do the same thing for the input selector. Now the input selector essentially selects what of the signal is actually going to be processed. So if I'm turning that off, for example, that essentially means that only the right channel is contributing to driving the compressor and only the right channel is also being processed. I can unlink that. So for example, I can say that I want only the left channel to be compressed with the input that comes from the right channel. Now for a stereo signal that might not make a whole lot of difference, or it might kind of sound a little strange, but if you have a multi-channel signal, this actually can become quite substantially important, because one thing that you can do, for example, is you can drive a compressor through the LFE channel or any other channel that you have in the multi-channel signal, and we are going to actually use that later when we are talking about Dolby Atmos. So much to the input configuration. Let's now turn our attention to the bottom module of Gravitas, and for that let me first reset the input configuration so that we are back to stereo processing, and then let's restart the audio. Now there are a couple of things that we can do here in the bottom row. The first thing is we can select an external sidechain input, and that external sidechain input can actually be a multi-channel input. Then we have a filter section that allows us to filter out what portion of the detector signal is going to drive the compressor. So if we want to only have the low end, for example, drive the compressor, we can select it here. Now note that by default, this filter is connected or linked with the overall filter of the compressor. That means that if we moved it here, we also move the signal that is actually being affected by the compression. But we can unlink that. So if I'm moving that back here and unlink that, I now have control over the compression signal or the detector signal alone, and that allows me, for example, to use only the low end in order to drive the compressor for the entire frequency spectrum. And then we can select the attack, hold and release time of the compressor, and then there are also settings for what's called the RMS time. That changes the nature of the compression, and we have a selection for the look ahead time in case we want to look ahead, and we can actually do that for 3 different compressors. So this is one of the features that is fairly unique. So we can actually select 3 different detectors, and that allows us to set that in 3 different ways. So for example, for the second detector, we can choose a different attack time and a different hold time and a different release time and a different look ahead time. And if we choose to use different compressor settings. We also can choose the input gain for each of those individual detectors. So for example, if you want to have the green one to be more dominant, we can increase that. And then finally, on the right side, we have link settings, and these link settings essentially define the degree according to which the individual channels that are driving the compressor are linked. So for example, if I'm setting that to 0, what I effectively have is a multi-mono compressor. So essentially it operates on each individual channel individually, and if I increase the link, that essentially means that the overall signal is going to affect all channels in the audio. And the way this is going to affect it can be set with the peak mode, and the peak mode essentially allows us to choose whether or not it is the average signal that is going to be selected. So in this particular case, if I'm setting that to 0, that essentially means that the average is going to have an effect on the compression, or I can increase that, which essentially means if I set that to 100%, it means that only the peak signal is going to affect the compressor. And if I set it to -100, then essentially it means that the lowest signal is going to affect the compressor. So there are a lot of different options that we have here, and there are a lot of settings that we can do. So this is actually a fairly unique compressor that pretty much does it all. But there's one additional feature that I think is really unique, and that is that Gravitas knows all the other instances of Gravitas, and we can actually interlink different instances of Gravitas within our session. In order to demonstrate that, let me do the following. Let me add Gravitas compressors to the two other tracks that we have. So one to the synth track here, and then we have another one here at the pad track. And if I do that, I can now go into this parameter linking editor. And this parameter linking editor, I will see the different instances that I have. So it recognized that there are 3 different instances in this session. And I can now start linking individual parameters of those instances so that I only have to control them in one instance, and it will automatically be applied to other instances. The way this is done is fairly straightforward. This is done through link groups, and there can be many link groups. By default, there's no link group selected. So let's just add one link group, and let's call that, I don't know, group 1, that's fine. And then let's just add our instances to this group 1. So there's the bass is in group 1, and the synth is in group 1. And what then it essentially allows you to do is that you can link individual parameters, and if you change them in one, it's going to be changed in all the others as well. So if I'm, for example, changing the input gain, and I'm linking the input gain between the different instances, if I change them in one instance of Gravitas, so let me just kind of move that down here just for demonstration purposes, and I'm going to kind of open that up in another track. Let's go to the second track here, and let's open that up here. You see that it has been changed here as well. So that is actually fairly unique, and that allows you to be very creative actually. And on top of everything, you can also automate that. So there are quite a few possibilities that you have here for creativity in order to make your workflow as efficient as possible. So this is actually really unique and very interesting. And this concludes our exploration of using Gravitas as a plugin in a regular session within a digital audio workstation. I believe this is a highly unique approach to dynamics processing in music production. I'm very excited about this plugin. However, where this plugin really excels is as a master bass insert in the Dolby Atmos Composer, and this is what we're going to do next. But before I continue, a quick reminder, if you have enjoyed this video so far, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions or comments, please either use the comment section below or join us on our Discord server. The invite link is in the description. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by becoming a member either through YouTube or Patreon. There's also a free membership option on Patreon. You can also use one of the affiliate links below or buy some of my In Immersion We Find Presence merch, like this coffee mug, for example. Links are in the description as well. All contributions to this channel are used to purchase the software and hardware I talk about on this channel. And with that being said, let's get back to Gravitas, this time as an insert within the Dolby Atmos Composer. So I've opened up a second project here, and what I'm going to do in this one is I'm going to demonstrate how to use Gravitas in connection with the Dolby Atmos Composer in order to do some sidechaining in the Dolby Atmos project. And we're also going to use the Spacelab reverb and send that into a multi-channel bed and then sidechain the multi-channel bed from the reverb as well. So this is going to be interesting. Let's first have a listen what we have here. And it's essentially the same pad loop. The only thing that I did here is I added a kick. So let's just have a listen. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that into Dolby Atmos, and I'm going to do that with the Dolby Atmos Composer. So what I have to do is I have to take an instance of the Dolby Atmos Composer and drop that onto my main track. This will open up the Dolby Atmos Composer. Once again, here you see the 128 channels that you have in a Dolby Atmos project. And currently no audio is routed into the Composer. In order to route the audio into the Composer, what I need to do is I need to add Beam plugins to the two individual tracks that I want to add to my Dolby Atmos project. So one here to the kick and then the second one here to the pad. And as soon as I do that, and I'm going to leave the audio in left and right, or in the position of the audio at left and right channels for the moment being. And let's just play that. And what I have now, if I open up the Dolby Atmos Composer, the two tracks coming in, and they are going to be routed into channels 1 and 2 of the Dolby Atmos master file. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to switch that over to objects because I first want to demonstrate how Gravitas works in connection with objects. So let's take the kick into object and then the pad into an object. And what that will do is it will assign the channels 11, 12, 13, and 14, so 4 object channels to the 2 stereo tracks. And then the other thing that I'm probably going to do is, let me just go into the pad and in the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin, let's just move that a little. Let's just move the left channel a little bit to the left so that we have a little bit more of kind of an immersive feeling. So that's everything that we're going to do. And then let's play the audio. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to add a compressor that takes the kick and does some sidechaining on the pad. And the way this is done with Gravitas is really, really simple. First of all, for those of you who have been working with the Dolby Atmos Composer, you notice that the new version of the Dolby Atmos Composer now suddenly here has a master channel button. And that master channel button does exactly what it says. It opens up a master channel. And on this master channel, we can add modules. Now, right now, the only module that we can add is Gravitas. I'm assuming that Fiedler Audio is going to make additional modules in the future, but that's just a guess. But what we want to do here is we want to simply add a Gravitas module. So let's just press add module, and that will add the Gravitas to our module. We can actually add multiple if we want to, but we only need one. So let's just remove the second one. And if we click on the open editor here, we essentially open up Gravitas. And now we have Gravitas working in the master channel of the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, what are the things that are different now? The most important thing here is that in the input section, we now can see all the individual channels that are in the Dolby Atmos Composer. So right now we have 4 object channels and we can see them here. We have the 2 kick channels, left channel, right channel, and the 2 pad channels, left channel, right channel. And what we want to do here is we want to really drive the compression of the pad with the signal of the kick. So what I'm going to do simply here is I'm going to deselect the pad as the detector input. That essentially means that the compressor now only reacts to what's coming through the objects on which the kick sits. I'm going to deselect link because I want to delink that, and I'm going to drive the pad channels with that particular compressor settings. And if I do that now, so let me just go back and let's play the audio again. If I take the... You see how the pad is sidechain compressed with the kick signal. Now I can fine-tune that by kind of making the selection here, kind of bring that down. Now one thing that I need to do here is in order to actually make that work correctly is I need to deselect the auto makeup gain, because that's really not what I want to do. I kind of that kind of gives me the wrong impression, so I need to deselect it in the particular case. And that allows me now to do all kinds of things. So I can use individual objects in order to drive the compressor settings of other objects. And I can even do more than that. Let me just stop the audio again. I can also drive multi-channel objects or even the Dolby Atmos bed with the compressor. So one thing that I could do, for example, is if I want to change the pad from an object into a composite, and in this particular case a 9.1.6 composite. So that essentially means that if I'm going back to the monitoring, I now have channels 17 and 18 to be the two channels that come from the kick, and the first 16 are the 9.1.6. That is essentially the pad that has been positioned into our Dolby Atmos bed, or actually into our Dolby Atmos composite, because it's actually more than 10 channels, so it's a 16-channel object bed. And then essentially what I can do is I can do exactly the same thing that I did with the two objects. I open up the Gravitas module and I need to go into the input selection. And in the input selection, I now have all the individual channels that I have in the Dolby Atmos Composer. So I have the individual composite channels and the two kick channels. What I want to do is I want to take the two kick channels and drive the composite. So I'm going to deselect all the composites here in the detector selection. Let me just deselect everything here. And then I'm going to do the exact opposite on the input selector for the processed signal. So I'm going to actually process the composite or the object bed in the Dolby Atmos Composer, and I'm going to deselect the kick. And what that will do is pretty much exactly the same thing. The only difference now is that we are processing not the pad not as an object, we are processing the pad as a bed, a Dolby Atmos bed, or more accurately, a Dolby Atmos composite in the Fiedler Audio Composer. So let's just play that again. I can play obviously with the release settings, the tech setting, hold settings, look ahead settings. I can use the 3 different detectors if I want to, and everything works perfectly fine. And this is actually really cool. So let's do one more thing, and this one more thing is I also want to add a reverb, and what I want to do is I want to use the Spacelab reverb, because once again we are in Ableton. Ableton is a stereo DAW, so we can't really use a multi-channel reverb because it's a stereo DAW. But one way to do that is with the Spacelab plugin from Fiedler Audio. So Fiedler Audio really created an entire Dolby Atmos production set of tools that you can use in any stereo DAW in order to do everything. And one thing is essentially multi-channel reverb. So let's do that. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe set the audio back the way it was. So I'm going to change the pad back to an object, and then let me just go back into the settings, and what I'm going to do is, once again, the kick is going to drive the pad. Yeah, so let's set that back, and now we are back to where we were before we changed the pad into a Dolby Atmos pad. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a reverb to the kick. And to do that, I'm going to take the Spacelab. I have Spacelab Interstellar. Spacelab comes in 2 different versions. You need to look at the Fiedler Audio website, what version works for you. I have Interstellar, which is the big version, which kind of, for most applications, I think the smaller version is perfectly fine. And I'm going to drop that into my reverb track. It doesn't really make any difference where you drop it. It just needs to be on a separate track. Let me just make sure that there's nothing else on there. No, there isn't. And then I'm going to instead of routing the kick into the Dolby Atmos Composer directly, I'm going to route the kick into Spacelab, and then from Spacelab into the Dolby Atmos Composer. And in order to do that, a couple of things. First of all, I need to, in the kick track, I need to remove the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. And I need to replace that with the Spacelab Beam plugin. And that Spacelab Beam plugin will then send the kick into Spacelab. Now I need to actually kind of change the gain here, because that's going to be too loud. Quite frankly, it depends on what exactly you're doing with Spacelab. But in this particular case, we will see it would be too loud if we increase the gain by 12 dB. And then I'm going to go into Spacelab. Now, in contrast to In contrast to the Dolby Atmos Composer, Spacelab requires you to actually connect the individual Beam plugins manually. So we need to go into the sources setup, and here we have this little cogwheel, and if we click on that, we can now select what input that has, and we want to actually have that input from the kick. That is essentially where our Spacelab Beam plugin sits. And as soon as we do that, we will see that we are going to have a reverb coming from the kick. So let's just play that. Then we can control the reverb here in the reverb settings. We can change the individual settings. Now I'm going to leave it as dominant as it is right now because I want to actually demonstrate how the sidechaining works. So normally, obviously, that would be a little bit too much, so we would reduce that. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I think that is perfectly fine. So now, how do I do that? Well, first of all, let me go into the Dolby Atmos Composer that sits on the main track. And in the Dolby Atmos Composer, you see that currently this kick is set to be a stereo signal, but we actually want to have that in 9.1.6. We actually want to have that in full multi-channel setup. So what we're going to do is in the format settings, I'm going to change that to 9.1.6. And that will then essentially turn that into 9.1.6, and we're going to get a 9.1.6 reverb. The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to separate out the dry signal from the wet signal, and you can simply do that by clicking here on the object button. And what that will do is it will generate two additional objects, and these two additional objects are essentially the dry signal from the kick. So let's just do that, and that will add those here. Now we have essentially four objects. Two objects are coming from the pad, two objects are coming from the dry signal of the kick, and then we have the composite or the object pad in Dolby Atmos Speak that contains the wet signal of the reverb. And now all we really need to do is we need to go into Gravitas and need to make the according or the appropriate selection for input and output, or for detection input and regular input. So let's go into the master channel settings. Let's open up the editor. So once again, go into the input selector, and in the input selector we now have all these individual channels here. And what we want is we really want to have the kick drive everything. So we're going to deselect everything but the kick. And then in the input selector here, we're going to select everything but the kick. So essentially kind of the kick signal drives everything, or drives the compressor for everything else. And that will essentially now drive the compressor that is responsible for compressing the signal of the objects and as well as the composite. And the composite once again holds the wet signal of the reverb. So let's see how that sounds. Now, once again, this is obviously a little bit too much for the reverb, but you get the idea that this is actually can be used in order to do some sidechain, some actually fairly advanced sidechain processing. Now, in order to reduce the reverb, let me go into the reverb settings of Spacelab. So what I can do here is I can simply reduce the wet gain. Maybe something like that. And I now have full sidechaining in Dolby Atmos with a Dolby Atmos master bus inside of the Dolby Atmos Composer. And this is super impressive. This is the only plugin that I know that can do that. You can't do that with the regular Dolby Atmos renderer or with any digital audio workstation. So this actually is spectacular. This is something I'm really excited about, and something that I think a lot of you will really, really enjoy. And that's everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching my videos. I truly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join us on our Discord server for a chat. And with that being said, see you all in the next video.